I never thought love would feel like poison until James said, "It's just a phase," and I realized the phase had already swallowed me whole. My chest burned, and I felt like screaming, but silence caged me. Sarah's smile across the table looked innocent, but I could taste the secret she wasn't confessing. I had given consent, I had given freedom, but what I got back was an ache I couldn't name. James laughed, brushing his fingers against Sarah's hand like it was casual, like I wouldn't notice. My heart screamed louder than my voice ever could. I wanted to believe this was still my love story, but every stolen glance cut another thread holding us together. Emily sat by the window, pretending not to see, her eyes glassy with the burden of everything unsaid. Michael stirred his drink like he was counting the cracks spreading across us. My patience was a candle burning too fast, melting into nothing while their hunger for more kept growing. If this was love, why did it feel like I was disappearing? James said, "We agreed this was freedom." But freedom felt like chains binding only me. I smiled faintly, pretending I believed him. Sarah's laugh echoed too brightly, sharp against my raw nerves. Emily stirred, shifting in her seat like the silence was suffocating her too. Michael glanced at me, his eyes asking questions I didn't want to answer. My heart kept whispering that love wasn't supposed to feel like erasure. I thought open meant expansive, but it only hollowed me out. Sarah said, "It's not a big deal," her voice feather light, but it pierced me like a blade. James chuckled, trying to dissolve the tension. Emily's gaze darkened, her silence screaming louder than words. Michael cleared his throat, but no sound followed. I clenched my hands in my lap, wondering if I was invisible, or worse, disposable. James said, "Don't make this bigger than it is," his tone sharp enough to cut. My chest tightened as if the air itself was gone. Emily slammed her mug down, startling Sarah, who flinched. Michael stared at the table, as if it held ounces none of us could speak. I wanted to scream, but fear wrapped around my throat. I whispered, "Maybe I was never enough," though no one heard. James reached for his drink, avoiding my eyes. Sarah stared at her hands. Emily's lips trembled but stayed shut. Michael looked at me, pain etched into his face, but he too said nothing. The silence was louder than any scream. The night carried me to our apartment, but peace didn't follow. James said, "You're overthinking this," his voice light, but my chest collapsed under the weight of it. Sarah's perfume still lingered on his shirt, sharp and undeniable. I wanted to ask him why her laughter echoed louder in his memory than mine. Emily sat on the couch, eyes glassy, pretending to read, but her silence screamed across the room. Michael leaned against the counter, his jaw set, arms folded, as if he could guard the space with sheer presence. I tried to tell myself love could stretch, but instead it snapped, piece by piece. Each word James said felt like a thread unraveling, the room filling with invisible strands of betrayal. James laughed softly, but it cut like glass. He said, "Sarah means nothing," and yet his eyes betrayed him, glowing with her memory. I felt my breath catch, anger simmering beneath my skin. Emily shifted on the couch, dropping her book to the floor with a thud that echoed louder than words. Michael's gaze darted between us, his silence heavy, his shoulders rigid. I whispered, "Then why do I feel like nothing?" But James looked away, pretending he didn't hear. The lie between us grew thicker than the air in the room. Emily finally spoke, her voice low but shaking. Emily said, "Do you even hear her?" James scoffed, rolling his eyes, muttering that she always took my side. Sarah wasn't there, but her shadow filled every corner, pressing against my ribs. Michael's voice broke the tension, steady but heavy. "This isn't balance, it's collapse." My throat burned with words I couldn't say, a scream clawing its way out, but locked behind clenched teeth. I thought love was a choice, but maybe it was always a battlefield. James raised his voice, saying, "I'm not doing anything wrong." The walls shook with the sharpness of it. I felt myself shrinking, my hands trembling against my lap. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back with iron restraint. Michael took a step forward, his presence filling the room like thunder. He said, "You made rules and you broke them. James looked away, muttering excuses that fell apart as soon as they left his lips. My heart sank lower than the floor. The silence after the storm was worse than the shouting. James slumped back, muttering that none of us understood. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, as though shielding from a cold no fire could burn away. Michael stood frozen, his fists unclenched, his anger now hollow. I whispered, "We're already lost," and the words tasted final. Love had become a negotiation. None of us could win. The air felt thick, unbreathable, and the walls echoed with everything unsaid. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, but it felt like knives across my skin. James said, "We need to stop fighting," though his voice held no weight of change. Sarah's name hovered in the air unspoken, but I could hear it between every syllable. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring into untouched coffee, her silence aching like a wound. Michael paced near the window, muttering curses under his breath, as though they could fix anything. I tried to hold my breath, hoping stillness could stitch together what was breaking, but the cracks deepened with every glance avoided. James said, "It's just adjustment," as though love were a shoe breaking in. I clenched my jaw, whispering, "Adjustment shouldn't feel like bleeding." Emily pushed her chair back hard, the screech cutting through us. Michael muttered, "Stop lying to yourself," his voice steady but cold. The walls seemed to tilt closer, the air charged with unspoken confessions pressing against our ribs. Silence clung like fog after his words, suffocating in its refusal to leave. Emily's voice cracked when she said, "She deserves more than scraps," pointing toward me. James scoffed, brushing a hand through his hair like this was beneath him. My chest swelled with rage, but no words escaped. Michael's voice cut clean, steady and sharp. "You've already chosen her. Stop pretending you haven't." The truth vibrated in the room, undeniable, searing through us like fire. James looked away, but his silence was confession enough. James shouted, "I love all of you," but the words collapsed under their own weight. My stomach twisted because love wasn't meant to sound like a plea. Emily's tears finally fell, streaking her face with quiet fury. Michael slammed his palm against the window frame, rattling the glass. I whispered, "No one loves like this," and the silence afterward was heavier than any scream. The kitchen felt like a graveyard when the shouting stopped. James leaned back, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like waves in storm. Emily's sobs softened into a broken hum. Michael whispered, "This isn't survival, it's slow death." I wrapped my arms around myself, whispering only to the air, "How much more until nothing is left of me?" The question hung in the room like smoke that refused to clear. The night wrapped itself around us, heavy and suffocating, as I sat on the edge of the bed, holding James' phone in trembling hands. My heart pounded like a drum as the screen lit with words that sliced me open. Sarah's messages were not casual notes or fleeting sparks of attention. They were love letters written in digital ink, intimate and shameless, like every promise James had ever made me was being mocked. My chest hollowed out as I scrolled, each line a hammer breaking bone. James appeared in the doorway, his face pale and frozen, his lips parting to speak, but his voice trapped. Emily gasped as she leaned forward from the chair by the window, her hand flying to her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Michael didn't flinch, his voice steadier than steel, saying, "This was never about freedom, it was about lies." The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering on the floor, and the sound felt louder than thunder. James' face broke into fear as he stepped closer, muttering, "It's not what it looks like." My throat burned as I whispered, "You swore," my voice cracking on the last syllable. The silence that followed was unbearable, each second dragging me deeper into the truth I never wanted to face. James stepped forward quickly, his words stumbling out like broken glass. "It was nothing, it didn't mean anything." But the phone screen still glowed, displaying Sarah's smiling photos, her words dripping with intimacy. Emily whispered, "She was never supposed to be more," her voice breaking, cracking through the silence, like lightning splitting the sky. Michael slammed his palm against the nightstand, the lamp rattling violently, his fury unrestrained now, spilling across the room in echoes. My chest burned as I screamed. You let her become everything, the sound clawing out of me, desperate and raw. James' eyes flicked back and forth between us, his mouth opening, then closing again, excuses turning to dust before they left his lips. Emily turned toward me, tears pooling in her eyes, whispering, "We trusted him. We trusted this." Michael's voice cut again. Trust doesn't break by accident, it shatters because of choice. I felt the weight of the room pressing into me, as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating us under the truth that could no longer be denied. The silence that followed was worse than shouting, because silence had become its own confession. James' voice rose, desperation cracking every word. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he shouted, but his tone sounded more like panic than truth. Emily cried openly now, her sobs cutting the air into jagged fragments, every tear screaming of betrayal. Michael's jaw clenched as his voice cut through the chaos, steady but sharp. "You meant every choice that led here. Don't dress them as accidents." James raked his hands through his hair, pacing like a trapped animal, muttering apologies that meant nothing, collapsing under the weight of exposure. I stood frozen, unable to look away, as Sarah's name seemed to seep into the walls, louder than all our voices combined. I said, trembling, "You didn't stumble into betrayal, you walked into it." My words landed like a thunderclap, silencing the chaos for a heartbeat. James' face crumpled as if struck, but he didn't deny it. His silence was louder than any confession. Emily's sobs turned into broken gasps, her body folding into herself, her pain echoing mine. Michael shook his head once, eyes locked on James, as though looking at a stranger we had never truly known. The room felt smaller with every second, filled with nothing but the stench of truth. Emily's voice erupted, sharp with fury. "You ruined all of us." Her words cracked, filled with the kind of rage that can only come from devastation. James clutched his head with both hands, muttering excuses, sentences broken, tumbling over themselves like shards of broken glass. His voice no longer carried charm, only panic and fear. Michael turned his face away, fists clenched so tight, his knuckles shone white, his shoulders rigid with fury, restrained only by exhaustion. My throat closed as I whispered, "I don't even know who you are anymore," the words leaving me hollow, drained of all resistance. James dropped to his knees, groaning, "Please, believe me, I love you." Emily laughed bitterly through tears, shaking her head. "Love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't destroy like this." The room fell into silence again, the weight of her words pressing into all of us. I closed my eyes, hearing the sound of my own breath, ragged and trembling, as though my body itself was rejecting what I was forced to face. Michael exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but cutting. "There's nothing left to save." The truth echoed through me, final and undeniable. James collapsed to the floor, his knees hitting the hardwood with a dull thud that felt like the sound of something irreparably breaking. "Please, I can fix this," he begged, his voice shredded, trembling, his hands reaching out to me like a drowning man. Emily turned her face into her hands, sobbing louder now, her body folding inward like a fragile shell cracking under pressure. Michael's voice cut sharp through the storm of pleas. "There's no fixing what you burned." His words carried the finality of truth, steady, unforgiving, stripping away the last layer of denial. James' eyes darted to me, desperate, pleading for a lifeline, but I felt nothing. For the first time since the beginning of this unraveling, my chest was still, my mind clear. Love had turned to ash, and all I saw was the ruin he created. I whispered, steady and cold, "You've already ended us." The words didn't rise, didn't shout, but they landed with the weight of eternity. Silence followed, thick and absolute, wrapping around us like the final nail in the coffin. The room didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like the grave of everything we had once been. The air cracked like thunder inside our apartment, words slamming harder than fists. James shouted, "I still love you," but love spoken through clenched teeth was no love at all. Emily's voice broke with raw fury as she screamed, "Love isn't supposed to destroy." Her tears came fast, streaking down her cheeks, her hands shaking as if they could not hold the weight of betrayal anymore. Michael slammed his fist into the table, glasses rattling, his voice a roar. You chose silence, and silence was the betrayal. My throat tightened as I gasped, every inhale sharp, every exhale trembling. I shouted, "You've broken me into pieces, and I can't carry us anymore." The walls seemed to bend inward under the storm of voices. My body quivered, yet the rage pouring from me was steady, like it had been waiting all along to be freed. James stood rigid, his face red with desperation, eyes wild as though trying to control a fire already consuming the room. Emily sobbed harder, collapsing into herself, but her voice was still fierce, still alive, lashing him with grief. I felt the storm reach its peak inside me, boiling into one thought: nothing will ever go back to what it was. James collapsed into the chair, tears brimming, his voice splintered. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The sound rang hollow, every syllable a crack in the foundation. Emily's sobs filled the room, jagged and sharp, echoing like broken glass. Michael leaned forward, eyes blazing, his voice steady but merciless. "You meant every lie you spoke." James' lips quivered, opening and closing, but no words carried meaning anymore. My palms pressed against my chest, as though I could hold the pieces of my heart together with sheer force. I whispered, "Then why does it feel like you enjoyed breaking me?" James' eyes widened, but no answer came. His silence was more violent than any scream. Emily rocked gently in her seat, her cries fading into whimpers, her face streaked with devastation. Michael shook his head, fists tightening as if to ground himself, refusing to look away. The silence thickened, until I could hear only the sound of our breathing, jagged and uneven. I realized then that truth had already burned through us, and only ashes remained. Emily slumped onto the couch, her body folding like something fragile had finally given way. Through tears, she whispered, "We should have never agreed to this," her voice barely carrying. James covered his face with his hands, sobbing, muttering broken apologies no one wanted to hear. His shoulders shook violently, every tremor another confession without words. Michael stood stiff, his jaw so tight I thought it might break, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. My own voice finally tore free, raw and trembling. "You've made me doubt my worth, my love, my existence." The scream ripped through me like lightning splitting the sky. Emily flinched at the sound, curling deeper into herself, muffled cries spilling from her hands pressed to her face. James didn't lift his head, but his sobs grew louder, shuddering with guilt he refused to voice. Michael's hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white, as if holding himself back from exploding into violence. I stared at James, but all I saw was ruin where once there had been love. The silence after my words didn't bring relief. It only made the devastation permanent. James pushed himself upright suddenly, his eyes wide and wild, shouting, "I can fix this!" His words rang through the room like broken promises dressed as hope. Emily's sobs only grew harsher, her voice tearing through him like a blade. "You've killed everything we built." She shook her head violently, her tears falling like rain, her pain flooding the air. Michael roared back, his fists slamming into the wall so hard the sound cracked through the silence. "Stop lying to us!" The wall shook, a picture frame tilting and clattering to the floor. I whispered, barely audible but sharp as steel, "There's nothing left to fix." James froze, his lips still parted, as if the words had cut the ground beneath his feet. Emily curled tighter into herself, rocking with grief, while Michael stood panting, his hand pressed flat against the wall, veins bulging. My chest heaved as I whispered again, stronger. "This is over." The words came out final, each syllable like the strike of a gavel. And for the first time, James said nothing. The climax fell like fire, devouring every last thread between us. James dropped to his knees, his hands clasped together, begging, "Please, don't leave me." His voice cracked, broken into pieces, spilling across the room. Emily pressed her face into her palms, sobbing uncontrollably, her body rocking like she was cradling her own grief. Michael's voice cut through the storm, quiet but resolute. "You destroyed us all." His words landed like stone, steady, final, impossible to move. I stepped back slowly, my body trembling, but my mind felt still, almost calm. My whisper came out steady, almost gentle, "I'm already gone." James froze, his arms still stretched toward me, his face etched with devastation. Emily's cries filled the silence, raw and unrelenting, echoing into the hollow space of what we once called love. Michael stared at the ground, silent now, his strength drained, but his truth already spoken. The room grew unbearably still, heavy with ruin. Love had turned to ash, and all that remained was the echo of my final words, ringing through the silence like the last bell toll of something that could never return. The house felt like ashes after the fire of our confessions. James sat silent on the couch, his eyes hollow, as though begging for forgiveness that would never come. Emily clutched a blanket around herself, her sobs quiet now, just faint echoes of grief. Michael leaned in the corner, arms crossed, his fury cooled into exhaustion. I stood by the window staring out at the night, whispering to myself, "Love doesn't survive like this." The room was broken, and so were we, each trapped in silence too heavy to escape. James whispered, "I never wanted to lose you," but his voice was brittle, a fragment of what once was strong. Emily shook her head slowly, eyes fixed on the floor as if nothing could bring her back. Michael muttered, "We've already lost everything that mattered," his tone final, stripped of anger, only tired truth. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, whispering, "There's no love left to hold." The silence that followed was not peace. It was the funeral of us. Emily said, "We thought rules would protect us, but they only built cages." James looked up, guilt carved deep into his face, muttering apologies no one answered. Michael exhaled sharply, shaking his head as though the air was poisoned. I whispered, "Maybe we never loved each other enough to survive the freedom we wanted." The truth lay between us like shards of glass, untouchable, unfixable, cutting everything still left inside. James said, "I still love you all," but his voice cracked, and no one believed him. Emily laughed bitterly through her tears, saying, "That's not love, it's greed." Michael turned his back, fists unclenching, exhaustion settling heavy on him. I whispered, "Maybe love was never meant to be shared this way." The words tasting of defeat. The truth stripped us bare, leaving nothing but shadows of what we once pretended to be. The night bled into silence, the kind that lingers after endings. James buried his face in his hands, shrunken from the man he once was. Emily curled into herself, rocking slightly as though to soothe the ache. Michael walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy, final, each one sealing the fracture wider. I stood alone by the window, whispering, "We are finished," and the words were the only truth left standing. The walls seemed to breathe with our ruin, and I finally let the silence claim me. Morning light crept through the blinds, but it didn't bring peace, only the ache of survival. James sat slumped, silent, his eyes bloodshot with defeat. Emily whispered into the stillness, "We don't know how to start again," her words trembling with loss. Michael had not returned since last night, the emptiness of his absence a wound spreading through the room. I stood at the doorway, suitcase beside me, whispering, "There's nothing left to rebuild." My hands trembled as I gripped the handle, but my chest felt strangely calm, like the storm had already burned itself out. James said, "Don't go," his voice cracked, but it was not a command, only a broken plea. Emily turned her face away, unable to bear another word. I whispered, "I already left when you chose her." My chest ached, but my feet remained steady, my body knowing what my heart feared. Silence hung heavy, pressing down with unbearable weight. The door before me felt less like an escape, and more like the only truth I had left. Emily's voice broke as she said, "We were all fools to think love could stretch without breaking." James buried his head in his hands, whispering apologies that no one listened to. I opened the door, the sound of hinges groaning louder than his sobs. The air outside was cold and sharp, cutting through me like clarity. Michael's absence was louder than all of us, his choice to leave echoing in my own. I whispered, "Goodbye," not to James, not to Emily, but to the version of myself that thought love could survive this. The outside world greeted me with silence, the street empty, washed in morning gray. My breath came in steady bursts, each one lighter than the last. Behind me, the house loomed like a tomb, holding ghosts I no longer belonged to. James' muffled sobs leaked through the walls, and Emily's faint cries echoed faintly. But I did not turn back. Michael's absence pulled me forward, as though he had already shown the path of leaving. My whisper carried into the cold air. I survived, but we did not. I stopped at the corner, suitcase heavy at my side, but my heart strangely light. The morning air stung my lungs, reminding me I was still alive. I whispered, "He said it was just a phase," but the phase outlasted my patience, and the words felt like final truth. Love had turned to ash, but I carried the scars forward. Behind me, the house remained silent, swallowed in its own ruins. Ahead, the street stretched empty, waiting, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it alone.